All right. So, hi Janice. Thanks for joining me again on my channel. This will be the second of the interviews that we'll be doing. How are you so far?
Yeah, I'm doing fine, Vasant, and thank you very much for inviting me. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation about the Montreal Massacre.
Right. Cool. So, before we proceed to the questions part, I would like to just read out a little bit of the context so that it will set the tone for the interview. On December 6, 1989, Mark Lepine shot to death 14 women at the engineering school of the University of Montreal in Canada. He then blew his own head off, leaving behind a suicide note in which he blamed feminism for mass hypocrisy and excoriated feminists for always trying to misrepresent men every time they can. Male survivors of the massacre have been criticized for not intervening to stop the shooter. In an interview immediately after the event, a reporter even asked one of the men why they abandoned the women when it was clear that his targets were women. And with that, Janice and I will be revisiting the Montreal Massacre incident, the feminist reactions, the unfair burden of responsibility expected from men, and the feminist blaming of all men based on this one incident. With that, let's proceed with the questions, Janice. Did I get the context right so far, or would you like to add anything more than that?
Yes, I mean that's very good. And I the only thing I think I would add is that it's important also to see this event as a pivotal moment, I would say, in North American feminist history, where feminists really decided to move forward with a radical agenda that would be enforced by the government and by other non-governmental, authorities and agencies. I think they exploited the Montreal Massacre in order to bring about a whole series of changes in law and public policy in North American society that actually had nothing to do with the massacre, but that they were able to push through because of the public sentiment that the massacre had created. So I think that's kind of interesting as well.
Got it. Okay. So the first one I would like to begin with is you must have seen the news reports about the incident for the first time back then. What was your initial reaction to the incident?
Well, I don't have a good response to this actually because although I must have, it was 1989. I was at the time a 26-year-old, 25-year-old, I guess, woman. I had just finished my master's degree. I was interested in feminism. I had read a lot of feminist theory already at that point, but I don't really remember. It didn't affect me that much. I was living in Vancouver, which is on the west coast of Canada. Montreal is kind of a different world in a way. And so I don't remember much. I didn't have much of a reaction. It's sort of like you hear of a sad thing and it doesn't affect you directly, and you just sort of think that's too bad. A couple years later, I was doing my PhD studies at the University of British Columbia. So I'm still in Vancouver. And I had a friend there who was a hardcore feminist. And she told me about how she had cried when she heard the news about what happened. And I do remember feeling a little bit embarrassed that I myself had not had that same reaction. And I think a lot of women respond to things like this in a similar way, in that other women, other feminist women in particular, sort of model the kind of reaction that is expected to any sort of event like this. So instead of just thinking of it as an event that occurred that was unfortunate, we are told that it impacts us personally and that we are to feel outrage and to feel a strong sense of personal connection to the victims and a sense of fear, anger, and hatred toward the perpetrator. And so that I got that message very clearly in 1991, and then throughout the 90s, that was very much the standard narrative that grew up around the Montreal Massacre. That this was it was a representative event. It was a symbolic event that Mark Lepine represented all men, and his victims represented all women in a misogynistic, woman-hating society.
So, is it accurate to say that the anti-male narrative that was built based on this incident was not detected early on when the incident happened, and it was only detected only probably a decade later or something like that? Would you say that?
No, actually, I would say the opposite. I would say that the anti-male narrative started immediately, like the next day. There was, there were a few people that said, look, this is an isolated incident, which it was. There had never been anything like that before in Canadian society, and there has never been anything like it in Canadian society since. So we're talking about 1989. It's getting close to, well, it's 35 years ago, getting close to 40 years ago. So a few people said that, and said that, we can't really understand why this individual did this horrific thing. But the reaction of most people, certainly women and a lot of men too, was to be angry immediately at the very notion that one could see it as a singular incident, and
Got
to
it.
insist that it was symbolic, that Mark Lepine was simply doing what most men think of doing all of the time, but don't, for whatever reasons. Nobody asked whether his his accusations against feminism had any legitimacy. Nobody asked whether, in fact, feminist ideology had created a very destructive polarization between men and women. Nobody said that maybe actually we should talk about how we might mitigate the negative impact of feminist ideology and feminist policies on men, especially on young men in our society. Of course, all those questions and forms of discussion were ruled completely out of order. And the response, as I say, within a day, was to start talking about violence against women generally, and to say that actually what had happened to these 14 women who were killed, there were also 10 other women who were injured,
Injured,
and
yeah.
four men also were injured. It was always emphasized that those 4 men were injured accidentally, just so that nobody, not even a smidgen of empathy or sympathy would be extended to the men who were hurt in the incident. So the idea was that the victims of that massacre represented all women who in their everyday lives were allegedly brutalized in the same way. And feminists right away started talking about this as a kind of symbol of domestic violence, that every woman in her home experienced similar types of coercion, control, abuse, etc., even though this was not an incident of domestic violence at all. And even though, of course, as we'll talk about later, perhaps Mark Lepine himself was a victim of domestic violence. So so I would say, like, within a day, there was a flood of opinion pieces, editorials, memorials were held, public speeches were made. Um, Presidents of universities, even the leader of Canada, made speeches about how this had to be understood in the context of misogyny, male violence, and female innocent victimization.
Right, right. So, what, according to you, could be the root cause? Like, is it misogyny or toxic masculinity or much deeper systemic issue? In the sense, I've mentioned to you about Robert Sapolsky's Emperor Has No Clothes event, the award ceremony speech, where he mentioned about a man who went unexpectedly from being a happily married man to complete bonkers, and he had ended up hurting so many people in the process. Initially assumed as a toxic male behavior, what they later found out was that he was suffering from this disease called as Huntington's, which most of them did not even consider as the root cause. So my question would be, in the same way, why are people refusing to take a deeper look into the background of Mark Levine.
Yes, yes. Maybe just before we get to that, I'd also like to say that it's been extraordinary to witness how this singular event has been memorialized in Canadian history, and I think in all of North American history. I think in colleges across the United States as well. Every December 6th is now a day that's set aside with a kind of religious symbolism
Yeah.
for men to be shamed and for women to feel outraged as innocent victims. It almost has the same status as our Remembrance Day or Armistice Day, which is the day where we remember our war dead. And that's on November 11th in both Canada and the United States. December 6th sort of rivals that as the day we remember our women who are dead, in the war against women, and that parallel is made frequently. Uh, and um, and in fact, it's really interesting that it's not only now December the 6th, it's actually expanded to be it was first a number of days. Now I think it's 14 days, or it might even be 16 days. I should have checked.
My goodness.
But it's like a long extended period of remembrance and action on violence against women. Or actually, they've expanded it now. It's not just violence against women, it's gendered violence, which means that it extends to include violence against lesbians, gay men. So if you're a gay man, at least you get some empathy for violence against you as gay, trans people,
Yes.
non-binary people, basically anyone who isn't a heterosexual man. And the message is very clear that gendered violence is a specifically horrific form of violence, even though violence against heterosexual men is far more common in our societies than against these special groups.
Yes.
But that form of violence is not mourned, is not commemorated, is just ignored and accepted. And and not only that, really, that it is a day when men are to bear the burden of their alleged shame and responsibility and complicity in violence. So they organize these events on campuses all across Canada and in some colleges in the United States, where men actually have to stand up and talk about their complicity as men who have not done enough and need to do more to atone for being born male. It
Yes.
is, to me, the most extraordinary act of public and institutionally sanctioned shaming of men and demonizing and scapegoating of men that one could imagine. And it has gone on, as I say, since 1989, building every year to extend to more and more victims. Sometimes there'll be like a special focus on Muslim women or a special focus on Indigenous women, but never just a general focus on, even though none of Lepine's victims were Muslim women. So it's
Yes.
ridiculous to associate that day with Muslim women or Indigenous women. They were all unfashionably white women, but that's no longer really, the thing that people are interested in. So we have to extend it in some way. And it could simply be a day in which we reflect on violence against everyone and how our societies can combat violence. In which case, we would have to acknowledge that violence against men is equally tragic and is, in fact, more prevalent, much more prevalent. But we don't do that because we simply,
Nobody
in our
cares.
societies, nobody cares. We accept the sacrifices that men make for women, for their countries, in killing work. I mean, the number of men who are
Workplace.
seriously injured or killed in the workplace every year is in the thousands. Nobody cares about that. Nobody even knows about it or mentions it. So we simply accept those sacrifices. We accept men's goodness and their heroism and their care for their families and everything else. And yet they have to carry around this burden of shame because of the bad behavior of a minority of men. It is really just the most astounding thing to me. And just before we do talk about root causes, all of this became institutionalized because the Canadian government decided that it would write a report based on the massacre, and it would write a report recommending what should be done to prevent or to end violence against women. They always say, we have to end violence against women. Violence against women, violence in general, can never be ended, I don't believe. It is, it's simply a fact of human nature that there is occasionally going to be violence, and sometimes quite frequently, but that utopian premise justifies these increasingly draconian measures, so that advocates can always say we haven't yet done everything we could do and we must do those other things. So the government said, okay, let's write a report. Again, it could have been a report looking at violence generally, and it could have acknowledged that men are the victims of violence. It could have been a report specifically about school shootings and what contributes to that problem and how it could be combated. It could have been a report about the increasing animosity in our culture that is expressed with official sanction against men. I mean, that could have been part of it. And to ask, do men have a legitimate reason to be concerned about what feminism is doing and how feminist policies and laws are changing our society? Do men have a legitimate grievance if affirmative action hiring laws exclude them from pursuing their own interests and aspirations? Do men have a legitimate reason to be concerned by, child custody laws in divorce that exclude men from the right to parent their own children? Do men have a right to be concerned when they are demonized in public culture, even as their rate of death and injury in all facets of our society continues to be much higher than that of women? All of those are legitimate questions, but of course they were not allowed to be asked. And instead, there was a report published 2 years after the Montreal Massacre, and it was called The War on Women. And it accepted the feminist narrative in all its details, and it proposed all sorts of solutions to violence against women that had nothing whatsoever to do with the massacre. Even things like, well, they talked about mandatory charging policies in cases of domestic violence, meaning that if any time a woman alleges that her husband or partner has been violent towards her, even if the police see no evidence to support the allegation, it was mandatory for charges to be brought against the man, not against the woman, of course. And that meant that even a man who was being abused in a domestic situation dare not call the police, because he would end up being the one charged and the one facing all of the serious criminal sanctions that came with that. Another one of the policies that was adopted was that judges would have the right to eject a man from his home in cases where domestic violence was being alleged. Again, what that had to do with Marc Lépine is anybody's guess, but the feminists successfully seized on it as a way to push for various favored policies, and they were successful in doing so because almost no one objected, because everybody knew that if they objected, they would then be claimed not to care about the deaths of women, and they would be shamed and publicly ridiculed. So it was really, it has been the most extraordinary thing, and it continues to this day with men standing up and having to apologize for being male because somehow that associates them with this act of violence. Yeah, it's been quite an extraordinary thing. So to get to your question about causes, of course, that's a really difficult one. We're not inside
Yes,
Mark Lepine's head. Um, but it is striking to me that there's so little interest amongst all these advocates who are allegedly trained in, understanding the effect of trauma, the effect of abuse, the effect of marginalization in society, all these people who talk about empathy for victims, etc. Almost nobody cares about the reality of Mark Lepine's life,
Mm.
which was that, as far as anybody can tell, he was not a symbol of male privilege. He was not a symbol of power or anything like that. He had a very difficult, lonely life. He seems to have been kind of a social misfit and an outcast with a very unhappy, troubled childhood and teenage years. And that
Yes.
surely had something to do with why he became the person that he became. And yet that's almost never talked
Mm.
about at all.
Yeah.
And if it were talked about, feminists would have to confront the fact that violence is a human issue, and that it, as Erin Pitsey discovered when she began to open up shelters and refuges for women and their children, often women are also very violent in the home. They are violent with their children, they're violent with their male partners. And as a lot of domestic violence research has shown, one of the key indicators of whether a woman will be seriously hurt or killed in an incident of domestic violence is whether she herself is
Initial.
violent
Mm.
with her partner.
Yeah.
And so if people really cared about keeping women safe, as they say over and over again, I would think one of the first messages that they would give to women would be to say, don't hit your partner. Do not smack him in the head. Do not kick him. Do not throw objects at him. But they never do say that because it's clear that women's lives are actually much less important to these advocates than the narrative.
Yes.
And the narrative is that domestic violence is a one-way street and that men are the perpetrators and women are the innocent victims. And so, yeah, that's just one example, of course, of the reality of domestic violence, which is that all responsible studies
Mm.
appear to show that women and men participate pretty equally in low level violence, hitting, punching, kicking, shoving, hair pulling, all of that sort of thing. And that in fact, women tend to initiate it more than men. And in cases where you have only one person engaging in the violence, it's more often women. And that yawning silence about female involvement in violence means that, we are not going to get to the bottom of it. We're not going to have effective programs or a useful public discussion about it. So that's unfortunate. But to get to the specific instance of Mark Lepine, what we do know about him is that his father was violent against him. It's not clear his mother's role in that. She's been very quiet about
Mm.
that. In when she did finally give an interview, she admitted to the violence of her ex-husband, but she seemed much more interested in excusing herself from any kind of responsibility. She said, "Oh, I don't know where he learned to be macho. It wasn't in my home." So she attributed his violence to toxic masculinity, basically, rather than recognizing that 7 years of abuse in her home may well have probably played the
Significant role.
foundational role.
Yes.
Yeah, and her husband was an immigrant from Algeria with a very unstable psychiatric history. And not that much is known about him, but what is known is that he was a very charismatic person. He was a successful businessman. For a while, they lived very well, but then his business started to fail, and he became increasingly violent with his children, particularly with Mark, whose original name was Gamil Garbi, and he changed his name to Mark and took his mother's maiden name Lapine in order to, I guess, signal his rejection of his father. His mother divorced his father at age 7, and so he grew up after that. His father, I don't know what happened to the father after that. The father didn't really have anything more to do with his family. And so he grew up without a father and longing, it seems, for a masculine identity in a world that increasingly told him that there is no real, positive masculine identity, that what boys can, they've got like two choices. And one is you can either be an abuser or you can apologize for being an abuser. Like those are the only two options. And it seems like Mark was interested in pretty traditionally masculine kinds of work and identity. He tried to join the Canadian military force, and he wasn't accepted. He pursued sciences. He pursued computer programming. Ultimately, he tried to apply to the School of Engineering at the University of Montreal, and he was rejected. And he felt that he was rejected partly because the school was doing an outreach to female students, and they were. I don't know for sure that that particular school was doing an outreach that year, but throughout the 1980s, schools of engineering all across North America were very aggressively recruiting female students because that was part of the whole feminist agenda. And so he was not wrong to suspect that a young woman with the same background and credentials and intelligence as he, even with lesser credentials and intelligence, would be chosen before him. So I can certainly understand why he would feel frustrated and feel that his aspirations were being blocked.
Yes.
And that at the same time, like he wouldn't even be thanked for that, right? There's never any acknowledgement in the feminist discourse that
Yes.
men have been extraordinarily patient and generous over decades of this kind of thing, where they've been told in no uncertain terms that they will have to take a back seat
Yes.
to women. They'll just have to. That's the way it is. Because they were born in the wrong sex, they will have to accept that their sisters are going to be the ones who are going to be given the best opportunities and who will be applauded and encouraged and given special training and special programs and special scholarships and will be featured in movies as the heroines and everything else. And not only do they have to accept that with a good grace, but they still have to be blamed as toxic whenever a man does something wrong. And they will never be recognized for their patience and their generosity under this kind of overt unfairness and injustice. So it's just an incredible catch-22. I'm still actually, I often think that I am surprised that more young men don't act out. I
Yes.
think their patience is extraordinary. And often we think, oh, this is something that's been going on for a brief time. But as the case of Lapine and the Montreal Massacre shows, no, this has been going on for 45 years at least. So we're talking about two generations of young men who've grown up knowing that all of their aspirations are considered secondary to those of young women. And that's a pretty uh, dangerous and explosive situation to deliberately create in a society and then not expect that are going to be any consequences.
Right, right. Since I think you pretty much covered at least three or four future questions that I would be asking, so I'm glad that you brought up many things, and that opened up to one of the brief things that I wanted you to acknowledge. I mean, I know that this could be a tough question, but I'll still try to frame it as good as possible. So, do you think acknowledging men's issues alone would have prevented this massacre in this scenario? In the sense that if we consider the spectrum of being soft and then being completely angry, no matter which path a man would choose to express the problems that he's facing, his problem would be the last thing that would get addressed as a result.
Yes.
So, is there any possibility that his issues would have been acknowledged better if it were not for the massacre, or at least as a man? Is there any possibility in this current society where a man's genuine grievance would be accepted and then, provided with a solution, given the nature of our gynocentric attitudes? What do you think?
Yes. Yes. Well, in the world that we live in, it seems that that is the last thing that feminists in particular and people in general, because it isn't just feminists. I know a lot of men and women who do not consider themselves feminist, who also are completely lacking in any sort of empathy for men, including for young men, and in fact, who seem to take pleasure in their suffering. The attitude in our cultures generally, I think, is that men had it good for a long time. They never acknowledged the suffering of men throughout history, but allegedly men had it good for a long time, and now it is women's time, and men are simply going to have to suck it up. And if that means that they don't get the job they want, if that means they get married and then their wife divorces them, takes all their money and alienates them from their children, and they're just left out on the trash heap, that's just too bad. They'll just have to put up with it. I have met people who don't consider themselves feminists at all, who laugh at the idea of male suffering and speak of instances of it with glee. So I do think we have an enormous problem that must in some way it must be rooted in nature, and then it's increased by culture, in which we simply do not care about male suffering very much. In fact, most people turn away from it. And it makes sense, of course. There's a great book by a guy named Roy Baumeister that you might know, called "Is There Anything Good About Men?" And he spends a lot of the book um, kind of giving his generally, like, he's a psychologist, and so he kind of draws on evolutionary psychology, which I don't quite understand fully, and I think it might be a somewhat dubious science to a certain extent, but some of the explanations make a lot of sense. And he points out that all successful civilizations have been based on the sacrifice of men, and the protection of women. And so if you're a society that depends on male sacrifice, then naturally you can't care as deeply about all of those men who are going to be sacrificed. You just can't, because you'd be torn up over it. And he talks about how yeah, if you're a society that's going to be sending men off to die in horrible ways in war and in the work that has to be done to build the society, your empathy is going to be lessened for them. And so unfortunately, that does seem to be the substratum of our society, and then that's overlaid with all of our cultural assumptions about female purity and
Right.
female innocence and female victimization. But I still think that we could do a heck of a lot better job than we do. We could change our culture, and I see no reason why there has to be the deep level of contempt that we now allow and even encourage and sanction, especially in women, but in men too. For example, every year when December 6th memorials come around, the Prime Minister of Canada will make a comment. And a couple of years ago, his comment was that the protection of women must be the foundation of any decent society. And, the glaring omission there, like people, there should be a public outcry about that. And I think we could change people's minds if we made it clear that it is unacceptable to so overtly care less about male suffering and male safety and death. And we should tell women in particular that it is ugly. It is a hideous form of bigotry to express contempt for men. And I think we could get somewhere if we could do that in a concerted way. So and so to get back to the question, I think it would make a difference to angry young men if their troubles were publicly acknowledged, and if it was made clear to them that there are groups of men and women working together who care about the situation of young men and who recognize their issues, not just in the dark corners of the internet, as it mainly is now, and then immediately denounced as anti-woman, but in government departments and in large corporations and by Hollywood stars or whomever it is that we look up to as our arbiters of public opinion. We could change the culture, and I do think it would matter to some young men who feel particularly lonely and alienated from their societies.
I think one of the interesting incidents for me, the aftermath of the massacre, is that a young man by name Sato Blaze, a graduate who hanged himself 8 months after the massacre, saying in his suicide note that he was torn apart by the guilt that he couldn't stop living. And which reminds me of Warren Farrell's observation that he made. Okay, that he says that the governments and as well as the society in general seem to use patriotism and male heroism as an indirect bribe for male disposability. So calling a man hero when he dies in war so we may survive, isn't it male sacrifice essentially? And doesn't it create a male self-worth paradox where a boy learns to value himself by not valuing himself, by putting himself
Yes.
in front of the line, not thinking about anything else? So, how do you characterize this about?
Yes. Yes. That's a really very powerful statement of Warren Farrell's, and as he so often does, he sums it up just beautifully. Now, again, I think there we get into the difficulty of something that is probably instinctual as well as cultural, and that the culture has built on the male propensity for heroism, heroic self-sacrifice. I think that is something that is deeply in a lot of men, and I'm not sure that it could be educated out just by talking about it. I've certainly had my impression of talking to men is that many men are um, much more willing to imagine that kind of self-sacrifice than any woman that I've ever known. And, there are cases where in nightclub shootings, for example, there have been a number in the United States where the men just like in that moment, as soon as the shots started ringing out, they just leapt on top of their wives or girlfriends and took the bullets and died in order to save their girlfriends or wives. Now, is that a cultured thing? I don't know. Partly I suppose, but I think partly it's also just how men are wired, because of how we've developed as a human species over the millennia. So I don't know that that could be kind of bred out of men, and I'm not sure that it would be a good thing even if it were. But certainly, I would say that again, it should be acknowledged and like dealt with. Like what? Like what a tragedy that that young man, Sarto Blay, killed himself for no reason at all. He should not have been made to feel responsible. And again, yes, feminist authorities and culture had a role to play in that. They were responsible for him feeling that way, at least to some large extent. And they should have done some serious self-examination as a result of his death. There should have been an outpouring of criticism of every single person who criticized those young men and said that they should have attacked Mark Lepine. How could they have done that? He had a gun and they didn't have anything. So it was ridiculous for them to have been blamed even for a moment for not laying down their lives for complete strangers who certainly would never have done the same for them and aren't ever expected to sacrifice themselves for men. And so it is really sad that he was so consumed by guilt that he would take his own life following that, out of a sense that he had failed as a human being. I just, yeah, that is so tragic. And this is of course something that is never discussed either when we're talking about male female socialization and nature, is how many men do kill themselves every year, and whether the vicious misandry of our cultures plays a big role in that. And why don't we do self-reflection on that? Why isn't there outreach telling men how they are valued and they are not disposable, and they should not for a moment think that their society is better off without them, as Sarto Blay clearly believed in that moment. And so yes, that's such a tragedy, and so many men are propelled by something that I think it should be. I mean, I guess maybe I somewhat disagree with Warren Farrell in the sense that I do think men should be honored for an impulse that I think is deep in a lot of men, that impulse to protect those that they see as more vulnerable or weaker. I think that is a marvelous thing, but it should not be expected and required of men, especially for strangers.
Stranger.
And you pointed out a bunch of
Examples.
incidents where men have tried to do good things for women, and the result is that they are charged with sexual assault, or women make false claims against them, and they are then suspected of some kind of criminal behavior. And I think, well, it's that big question: why are men so propelled to sacrifice their own best interests out of love and care for beings who often do not return the favor at all, and in fact are willing to destroy them?
Yeah. I think I'll be able to read out the headlines of those few incidents that I had pointed out to you, just for quick reference for the audience. The first one would be
Yes.
a Chinese teacher aged 42 faces groping allegations for performing a CPR on a woman. That's the first one. Second would be a mother of five who falsely accused Good Samaritan of rape after he gave her a lift home, or when all he did was that he found her drunk and crying in the street, and he's been jailed after that. The third one is dad of three allegedly murdered by the female hitchhiker who he was trying to take to a warming shelter just to help her out. This is the end result of men being good Samaritans, and there is
Yes.
no gratitude for that expression of men's goodwill and wanting to help others and all that. So, following
Yes.
that, I want to know if men are expected to help strangers at the risk of losing their own lives, knowing fully well that they have a family back at home to take care of. Isn't this can this be stated as an unpaid labor of men? And why should men sacrifice themselves when the risks outweigh the benefits?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And I mean, it is such an interesting problem, I think, because I think, most of us in the men's issues advocacy community would strongly caution men against doing that. And I would agree with Warren Farrell that a man's value does not inhere in his willingness to sacrifice himself. Men have value in themselves, in being who they are, not in whether they are willing to sacrifice themselves, usually for women. But at the same time, I know a lot of men who take deep pleasure in helping others. Like it's such a drive in men that it's hard to see how it could just be recognized as a weakness. And I do think it is something incredibly admirable. It's one of the things that to me, it seems that it distinguishes men in general from women. Not that men should be held to that standard, but that it should be recognized as a masculine quality. And it's something that most women lack, probably, again, for understandable reasons. Women, I guess, evolved to be very protective of their own selves and of their children, and to act in ways that will maximize their own chances of survival and those of their children, whereas men evolved in different ways. And because men strive for status and being useful is one of the ways that men prove their importance to the group, and that's how they gain status. So here I am talking as if I'm some sort of evolutionary psychologist, but it certainly does make sense. And so I think that it's a deep drive in a lot of men, and I wouldn't want to take that away. And one friend of mine even said, like, he for a long time he enjoys, if he's driving somewhere and he sees somebody pulled over whose car is broken down, he stops and helps them, and he gets a lot of pleasure out of it. And he said, well, it's not really self-sacrifice if I get pleasure out of it. And it's something he does. He says it's not really for the other person, or it is, but it's also for himself, and it's part of his identity as a man. That and because he has those practical skills, he understands cars, and so he can fix things. And so, like, again, I wouldn't want to just poo-poo that and say don't do it. At the same time, I want men to protect themselves. So it's a real conundrum. And I guess we're back to, if we lived in a society where we really appreciated what men do, and we respected men again for all of the wonderful qualities that they bring to our societies, I think maybe then that would be at least a good place we could start talking about how men can protect themselves while still being who they are. But
Right.
we're not there. We're just in a society where their sacrifices are demanded and taken for granted and ignored all at the same time. If you try to bring them up, most women will even deny that they exist, while at the same time, any bad thing that any man does is somehow the burden that all men must bear. So yeah, it's just a crazy society. And I often hear men saying, well, we're going to stop. We're just going to withdraw. And of course, there is a movement of men, sort of
Right.
withdrawing their labor from society, walking away, not making women the center, all that. And I totally support it. Um, it's just that I don't see a majority of men doing that, because I think men get so much of a sense of pleasure and purpose out of bringing what they have to society and giving it, that I just, I'd like there to be a general strike of men. I would like there to be every year there's a day when men just don't do anything at all, and where we actually as a society have to face how much we need men. And I'd like to have a day where we celebrate the things that men particularly do and give to their societies in all forms, whether in sacrifice in war or just the, incredible achievements and inventions and initiatives and everything that men do, their incredible obsession with making things and improving things and inventing things. And just being masculine, all of the different qualities that men have. So yeah, I'd like for there to be that sea change in our cultural attitudes. But in the meantime, I guess it makes sense to really caution men about putting themselves forward. And men do need to be aware of the vicious side of a lot of women.
Yes. I think we addressed a very interesting thing in our last interaction, and I have an additional thing to add to that as well, which will be this, that this is a topic regarding the feminist double standards. Okay, we often hear, and I'm sure you're aware of that, that when most of the women online would say some things like, "Yes, all men," followed by a very, I would say, cognitively impaired statement that goes like this: we don't we don't hate men as individuals, we hate men as a system. And that somehow justifies their expression, yes, all men. But here's the catch. If that's the case, because the top 10 terrorist organizations in the world are of Islamic origin, and yet we see most of those feminists and women especially quickly come to defend Muslims, saying, not all Muslims are like that. You can't blame all Muslims because of some people who are into terrorist actions. That doesn't define Muslims as a whole. So, I mean, one man committed a crime in 1989, and me as a man today is expected to take blame for what someone has done decades ago. And I'm somehow supposed to feel the shame, and I should inherit the sense of responsibility and respect for women, especially, with no other justifications. So, what even is happening? Why is this the case? It really bothers me. I mean, I have an extended question
Yes,
over this, but this is my expression. Why the hell
I
are we
know.
like
Well, you
this?
you really put your finger on it. Yeah, I mean, it's like it's beyond, it cannot be explained. Feminism wouldn't have any standards if it didn't have double standards. On one level, I think um, there's just so many different impulses in feminism. One is that feminism has become deeply anti-Western. It's against individualism, it's against freedom, it's against capitalist free enterprise. It's against everything that the West once stood for. And so it has aligned itself with the enemies of the West, and it admires Islam for its hatred of the West. It admires Islam, from a sort of Marxist or Maoist perspective as a collectivist, anti-Western ideology. I think it admires its bloodthirstiness. There is an element of the left, which feminism is a part, that really loves um, utopian and murderous leftist ideologies. And Islam is right up there, so is, of course, communism, a lot of those sorts of collectivist ideologies, elements of radical queer trans ideology are also very murderous and hateful. So anytime you have that kind of a utopian ideology, it tends to glorify violence in the name of its ideal. And so I think there's partly that too. It shifts, the thinking shifts, and it is um, feminism is willing to give a pass to the violence and even the misogyny of Islam, because it sees itself as in some way allied with Islam. I think that's the simplest answer. But there also, a lot of my friends have theorized that there's a really weird, vicious circle going on too, in which feminist women weaken their own men. They demand that they be softer. They demand that they, apologize for their toxic masculinity. And then they develop contempt for them and begin to admire enemies of their own men. And Islamic men certainly represent a different form of masculinity. And that becomes very attractive to certain feminist women. And so maybe even unconsciously, or certainly not, they don't admit that one of the reasons they are so quick to defend Islam is because they're actually attracted to the violence that it propounds, and especially the masculine violence that it embodies and justifies. So,
I mean,
but I'm not
I'd like
sure.
to, that's all right, that's all. I'd like to add only one short point, continuing this, that this is how I found out that Islam is highly gynocentric in nature completely, because Islam and Sharia law has specific instructions to punish men who sexually exploit other women or girls or whatever it is. And then in India, recently I've come across an incident where a Muslim woman has sexually exploited a boy, a minor boy. And then I tried to look up Sharia law and all the Islamic scriptures and try to see if there was any punishment that is being, that's been instructed to uh, put it on the woman, and then see if this woman would be punished because of her actions. And I found no result at all. There's no mention of punishing women. There is no mention of women sexually exploiting minor boys and as well as men. And I think that's something I would want the audience to look out for and test whether.
Yes.
So that's,
Surprise, surprise.
yeah.
Islam turns out to be gynocentric as well. Who would have thought? Yes, I found that too. I was doing a little bit of research, not much, but a little bit into the Islamic Republic of Iran and its Sharia punishments. And because everybody, when they talk about Iran and what's been going on there, over the last few years with protests and that, they always talk about women and all the glorious women. They're throwing off their hijabs. They're so brave. They're this and that. But if you look into the numbers of men, young men especially, but men of all ages, who have been killed because of their protests against the Islamic regime, and you compare that to the number of women who've been killed, it's the men massively outnumber
Outnumbered.
the number of women. And then if you look at the specific Sharia punishments, exactly as you said, like there are all sorts of punishments for men for whether it's sexual transgressions, political transgressions, apostasy, various things. And the men are punished much, much more harshly. And there's no equivalence between the types of transgressions that are identified in the Sharia law lists. Even things like, they do that horrible thing where they actually amputate people's fingers and then whole hands and sometimes feet if they're convicted of theft. And I tried to find whether any woman had ever had a finger amputated. And I couldn't find a single one, where every year hundreds of men have fingers or hands amputated. And so like again, the punishments for male transgression are much harsher, and women are protected in all sorts of ways from bearing the full weight of the regime, even though we always like to imagine that it's women who suffer the most. Clearly it's not the case.
Then, and I think we've covered pretty much everything with respect to the topic. Do you think, did I miss out anything that you may point out, and then uh, we'd like to put an end to this conversation?
um I don't think so. I think we did. I think we pretty well covered everything that
Yeah,
that
I feel
we
that too.
thought we might like to. So yeah, I enjoyed the chance to discuss with
Yeah.
you, and yeah, I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Yes, likewise, likewise. So I think that's the end of the session then. Thank you so much, Janice, for joining the discussion. And it's a wonderful chat. I really enjoyed it. And I hope to do this session again with you in the future.
Yes, me too. Yes, the same with you. Yeah, I like your questions a lot, and I really enjoyed the chance to discuss those issues.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.